I asked a question once. Let me tell you what that means, truly means, in an imperium where faith is not merely encouraged but mandated, where doubt is not merely discouraged but criminalized, where the simple act of wondering whether the words spoken from the pulpit might be incomplete or mistaken, or shaped by human interests rather than divine revelation, can cost you everything. Your position, your family, your freedom, your life, your very soul consigned to damnation by authorities who claim to speak with the emperor's own voice. I asked a question, one question, in a moment of weakness that I have had 40 years to regret, and the answer I received was not theological but pedagogical, a lesson in why questions are forbidden, delivered through methods that left scars on my body and deeper scars on whatever remains of the faith I once held with such fervent certainty. I was a priest once. I was a true believer. My name is Confessor Malchus Vaughan. Was Confessor Malchus Vaughan before the Ecclesiarchy stripped me of my title and my robes and my place in the hierarchy that had been my entire identity since the day I was taken from my family and placed in the Schola Progenium at the age of 7. I served the imperial creed for 53 years, preaching the emperor's word on 11 worlds across 3 sectors, bringing the light of faith to populations that numbered in the billions, saving souls that might otherwise have been lost to heresy or despair, or the simple creeping apathy that claims so many in a galaxy where hope seems like a luxury reserved for those too ignorant to understand their true situation. I believed, truly believed, with every fiber of my being, that the words I spoke were sacred, that the rituals I performed connected my congregations to a power beyond mortal comprehension, that the Ecclesiarchy was the emperor's own instrument on the material plane, guiding humanity towards salvation through the darkness of a universe that sought to destroy us. I do not know what I believe now. Belief requires certainty, and certainty was burned out of me in the chambers, where the Ecclesiarchy teaches its priests what happens to those who forget that faith and questions cannot coexist. I was born on Ophelia 7, one of the cardinal worlds that serve as the beating hearts of the imperial creed, a planet so saturated with faith that the very air seemed to carry the weight of 10,000 years of accumulated devotion. My earliest memories are of cathedrals, vast spaces of stone and gold and stained glass that dwarfed the human forms that moved through them, architecture designed to make worshippers feel small and insignificant before the majesty of the God Emperor they had come to venerate. I learned to walk in the shadow of those cathedrals. I learned to speak by reciting the prayers that my mother whispered over me each night. I learned to think, or believed I was learning to think, through catechisms that provided answers to every question a child might ask, answers that led always to the same conclusion. The emperor protects, the emperor provides. The emperor requires our faith and our obedience, and our absolute submission to the hierarchy that speaks in his name. I was 7 years old when the Ecclesiarchy claimed me. My parents were devout, as all citizens of Ophelia VII were devout, and when the robed officials came to our HAB unit and announced that I had been identified as a candidate for the priesthood, they wept with joy rather than grief. To give a child to the Ecclesiarchy was the highest honor a family could receive, proof that the emperor's gaze had fallen upon their bloodline and found it worthy of contributing to the great work of spiritual governance that kept humanity united across the stars. My mother kissed my forehead and told me that I would do great things in the emperor's service. My father knelt before me, his own son, a child of 7 years, and asked for my blessing, as though the mere fact of my selection had already elevated me above the common faithful. I never saw them again. The Ecclesiarchy does not permit its priests to maintain connections to their former lives, does not allow the bonds of blood and birth to compete with the bonds of faith that must be a priest's only family. I was taken to the Schola Progenium, placed among hundreds of other children who had been similarly claimed, and the process of transformation began. The reshaping of a child into an instrument of the imperial creed, a vessel for doctrines that would be poured into me until there was no room left for anything else. The education was comprehensive. The indoctrination was absolute. I learned the history of the Ecclesiarchy, how it had risen from humble origins in the centuries after the emperor's internment upon the Golden Throne, how it had grown to become the largest institution in the Imperium, how it had weathered schisms and reformations, and the terrible age of apostasy, when the mad Goge van Dyre had nearly destroyed everything the faithful had built. I learned the structure of the faith, the cardinals and the archcardinals, the confessors and the preachers, the missionaries who carried the word to worlds that had never known the emperor's light, and the drill abbots who ensured that faith was backed by the strength of arms. I learned the rituals, hundreds of them, each one prescribed in exact detail by texts that had been accumulating for 10 millennia, each one designed to channel the devotion of the faithful toward the emperor and away from the false gods that lurked in the darkness beyond the veil. And I learned, above all else, that questions were forbidden, not explicitly, not in those terms. The scholar did not tell us that questioning was prohibited. Such a statement would itself raise questions about why prohibition was necessary. Instead, they simply made questioning impossible, filling every moment of every day with prayers and lessons and rituals that left no space for independent thought, no gap in the schedule where doubt might take root, no silence in which a child might wonder whether the answers they were being given were truly answers, or merely walls built to keep certain thoughts forever outside the boundaries of the acceptable. I graduated from the Schola at the age of 22, fully formed, fully faithful, ready to begin my service to an ecclesiarchy I loved with the totality of my being. I believed that I had been given the truth, the whole truth, the complete and unalterable word of the emperor, as transmitted through his chosen representatives across 10,000 years of sacred tradition. I believed that my role was simply to share this truth with others, to bring the light of faith to those who dwelt in darkness, to save souls through the power of words I had been given and rituals I had been taught. I did not know that the truth I carried was incomplete. I did not understand that the faith I preached was a tool as much as a salvation, an instrument of control as much as an offer of grace. I did not recognize that the Ecclesiarchy's prohibition against questions existed not because questions were dangerous to the faithful, but because questions were dangerous to the Ecclesiarchy itself. I served for 53 years before I learned these things. 53 years of preaching, of converting, of bringing billions of souls into a faith that I believed with absolute conviction was their only hope of salvation in a universe that offered no other mercy. And then I asked a question. It was a small question, really. A minor theological point, a discrepancy I had noticed between two sacred texts that had both been declared infallible by authorities whose infallibility I had never thought to doubt. I asked it of my superior, a cardinal whose wisdom I had always admired, expecting that he would provide an explanation that would resolve the contradiction and strengthen my faith as countless such explanations had strengthened it throughout my years of service. He did not provide an explanation. He provided an education. He taught me what happens to priests who notice contradictions. He taught me what the Ecclesiarchy does to those whose faith falters, whose certainty wavers, whose minds commit the unforgivable sin of wondering whether the institution they serve might be fallible, might be human, might be something less than the perfect vessel of the emperor's will that it claims to be. He taught me why no one ever questions the Ecclesiarchy. And now, 40 years later, I will teach you. Let me tell you what I learned in the chambers beneath the cardinal's palace, what truths were carved into me by those whose sacred duty is to ensure that truth remains forever singular, forever unquestioned, forever safe from the contamination of minds that have forgotten that faith means accepting what you are told without ever asking why. Let me tell you why the faithful do not question. Let me tell you why questioning itself is the gravest heresy, worse than any mere deviation from doctrine, more dangerous than any external threat the Ecclesiarchy has ever faced. Let me tell you what happens when a priest remembers that he has a mind of his own. The first world I served was called Kalos Tertius, a mining colony at the edge of the Segmentum Obscurus, where the population had never known anything except darkness and labor, and the cold comfort of a faith that promised them reward in death for suffering they could not escape in life. I arrived with fire in my heart and certainty in my soul, ready to bring the emperor's light to people who had been neglected by the Ecclesiarchy for generations, whose priests had been few and poorly trained, whose understanding of the imperial creed had drifted toward interpretations that bordered on heresy without ever quite crossing the line into outright apostasy. I was 23 years old, freshly ordained, burning with the zeal that the scholar had cultivated in me across 16 years of relentless formation. I believed that I could save them. I believed that my words carried power that transcended mere rhetoric, that the emperor himself spoke through me when I mounted the pulpit and opened my mouth to preach. The people of Kalos Tertius taught me otherwise. They listened to my sermons with eyes that had seen too much suffering to be moved by promises of future reward. They attended my masses with bodies broken by decades of labor in the deep mines, kneeling on joints that screamed with pain, bowing heads that carried the weight of exhaustion no amount of faith could lift. They performed the rituals I demanded because the alternative was to be reported to the Arbites for failure to observe the mandatory devotions, to be dragged from their hab units and subjected to corrections that would leave them even less capable of the work that was the only thing keeping them alive. I saw on Kalos Tertius what faith looked like when it was divorced from hope. I saw congregations that prayed because they feared the consequences of not praying, that confessed sins they did not believe were sins because confession was required, and failure to confess was itself a sin requiring confession. I saw children who had learned the catechisms as I had learned them, word for word, answer for answer, but whose eyes held none of the wonder that I remembered feeling when I first understood that the emperor was real, that he watched over us, that our lives had meaning in the context of a plan so vast that individual suffering became insignificant against it. I should have questioned then. I should have wondered whether something was wrong, whether the faith I had been taught to preach was failing to reach these people, or whether these people had simply seen through it to something I was not yet able to perceive. But I did not question. I was not yet capable of questioning. The scholar had done its work too well. Instead, I blamed them. I told myself that their faith was weak, that their devotion was insufficient, that the emptiness in their eyes was a reflection of their own spiritual failures, rather than a response to the conditions in which they were forced to exist. I preached harder, demanded more, instituted additional observances and penances that I believed would strengthen their connection to the emperor and lift them from the despair that seemed to permeate every aspect of their existence. The despair did not lift. The emptiness did not fill. The people of Kalos Tertius continued to suffer, continued to labor, continued to pray because they were required to pray, and not because prayer offered them anything except the temporary reprieve of fulfilling an obligation. I served there for 7 years. I saved no one. The Ecclesiarchy transferred me to another world and another, and another still, each one presenting variations on the same fundamental reality. Populations that observed the faith without believing it, that performed the rituals without feeling them, that submitted to the Ecclesiarchy's authority because submission was mandatory and resistance meant death or worse. I preached to hive workers who had never seen the sky, to agricultural laborers who worked themselves to death to feed worlds they would never visit, to soldiers who killed and died in wars whose purposes they would never understand. I told them all the same things, that their suffering had meaning, that their obedience would be rewarded, that the emperor loved them and the Ecclesiarchy spoke for the emperor, and therefore they should love the Ecclesiarchy and obey its representatives without hesitation or doubt. Some of them believed. Some of them, perhaps, even found comfort in believing. But most of them simply endured, adding religious observance to the list of duties that consumed their lives, making room for faith alongside labor and sleep, and the brief moments of personal existence that the Imperium permitted them between the demands it placed upon their time. I began to notice things across those decades of service. Small things at first, discrepancies in the texts I had been taught were perfect, variations in ritual practice between worlds that should have been uniform if the Ecclesiarchy's claims of doctrinal consistency were true, passages in ancient scriptures that seemed to contradict passages in newer ones, questions that arose naturally from careful reading, but that no one around me seemed willing to acknowledge existed. I set these observations aside, filed them in mental categories that I promised myself I would examine later, told myself that my confusion was simply the result of incomplete understanding that further study and prayer would eventually resolve. The observations accumulated, the questions multiplied. The categories I had created to contain them began to overflow. I noticed that different cardinals interpreted the same texts in different ways, each claiming absolute authority for interpretations that could not all be simultaneously correct. I noticed that the Ecclesiarchy's histories contained gaps and contradictions, that suggested events had been recorded differently by different authors, or perhaps recorded once, and then altered to suit purposes I could not identify. I noticed that the prayers I had been taught as a child on Ophelia 7th were not quite the same as the prayers taught on other worlds, that words had been changed and phrases added and entire sections omitted according to patterns that seemed to correlate with political rather than theological considerations. I noticed, and I did not speak. This is what the scholar truly taught me. I understand now. Not faith, not devotion, not the love of the emperor that I believed had been kindled in my heart. The scholar taught me silence. It taught me to observe without commenting, to notice without questioning, to see the cracks in the edifice of doctrine and to plaster over them with my own refusal to acknowledge what my eyes were showing me. It taught me that the faith was more important than the truth, that the institution was more valuable than the accuracy of its claims, that my role was not to understand but to perpetuate, not to seek but to enforce, not to question but to ensure that others never developed the capacity for questioning. I was good at this. 53 years of service proved how good I was at this. I rose through the ranks of the Ecclesiarchy, my talent for preaching and my administrative capabilities earning me positions of increasing responsibility and authority. I became a confessor, charged with hearing the doubts of the faithful and resolving them through prescribed responses that led always back to obedience, always back to submission, always back to the fundamental message that questioning was itself a sign of insufficient faith. I heard thousands of confessions across my career, tens of thousands, and in every one, regardless of the specific sins being confessed, I heard the same underlying crime, the crime of thinking, of wondering, of allowing the mind to operate independently of the constraints that the Ecclesiarchy had established to keep it safely contained. I absolved them all. I gave them penances and prayers and reassurances that their doubts were temporary, that their faith would return if they simply tried harder, prayed longer, submitted more completely to the wisdom of an institution that had been guiding humanity for 10,000 years. And I believed what I told them. I believed it even as I committed the same crime they were confessing, even as my own doubts accumulated in the shadows of my consciousness, even as the questions I had been setting aside for decades grew into a weight that became harder and harder to ignore. The breaking point came on a world called Therion Majoris during my 53rd year of service. I was reviewing ancient texts in preparation for a sermon series on the origins of the Imperial Creed, seeking to deepen my understanding of the theological foundations that I had been preaching for half a century. The texts were old, truly old, dating back to the early millennia after the emperor's internment, written by saints whose words had been declared infallible, by councils whose authority had been affirmed by every cardinal and archcardinal since. These were not obscure documents or questionable sources. These were the bedrock of the faith, the foundations upon which all subsequent doctrine had been built. And they contradicted each other, not subtly, not in matters of interpretation or emphasis. They contradicted each other directly, unambiguously, in ways that could not be reconciled through any amount of theological creativity. One text declared that the emperor had always been divine, had been a god since before his birth, had merely concealed his divinity during the Great Crusade for reasons that his wisdom alone could comprehend. Another text, equally venerated and equally infallible, declared that the emperor had been mortal, had become divine only through his sacrifice upon the golden throne, had achieved godhood rather than possessing it from the beginning. Both could not be true. Both had been declared true by authorities whose judgment I had been trained to accept without reservation. I should have done what I had always done, set the observation aside, promised myself I would examine it later, plastered over the crack with my own refusal to acknowledge its existence. This was the path of safety, the road that led back to the comfortable certainties I had enjoyed for 5 decades, the choice that would preserve my position and my faith and my identity as a servant of an institution I had given my entire life to serve. I did not make that choice. I do not know why. Perhaps the weight of accumulated questions had finally become too heavy. Perhaps something in me had been waiting for precisely this moment, this undeniable evidence that the foundations I stood upon were not as solid as I had been taught to believe. Perhaps I simply made a mistake, spoke when I should have remained silent, allowed a moment of weakness to undo 53 years of disciplined obedience. I brought the texts to Cardinal Hector Vassius, my superior, a man I had served under for 15 years and trusted as completely as I trusted the doctrine he enforced. I showed him the contradiction. I asked him, in tones of genuine confusion rather than challenge, how these two infallible texts could assert incompatible truths about the most fundamental question in imperial theology. I asked a question, and in that moment, everything I had been, everything I had believed, everything I had built across half a century of faithful service, all of it ended, replaced by an education in the true nature of the faith I had served and the institution that enforced it. Cardinal Vassius did not answer my question. He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes holding an expression I had never seen in them before. Not anger, not disappointment, not the righteous fury I might have expected from a man whose subordinate had just committed the gravest of sins. What I saw in his eyes was something closer to pity, tempered with a resignation that suggested he had witnessed this moment before, had stood in this exact position with other priests who had made the same mistake I was making, had delivered the same response he was about to deliver to me. "You have served well, Malchius," he said, and his voice was gentle in a way that made my stomach clench with sudden fear. 53 years of faithful service. Millions of souls brought to the Emperor's light through your preaching. You have been an exemplary priest, a credit to the scholar that formed you and the Ecclesiarchy that elevated you. He paused, and I saw something shift in his features. A hardening, a closing, a withdrawal of whatever warmth had existed in our relationship across 15 years of shared service. But you have asked a question, and questions, as you should have learned long ago, cannot be permitted. I tried to speak, tried to explain that I had not meant to challenge doctrine, that I was simply seeking clarification, that my faith remained as strong as it had ever been, and that I merely wanted to understand how two infallible texts could contain contradictory claims. The words would not come. My throat had closed around them, constricted by a terror that I had not felt since childhood, since the earliest days in the Scholar, when I had first learned that the universe was full of things that wanted to destroy humanity, and that only the Emperor's protection stood between us and annihilation. Cardinal Vassius pressed a button on his desk, and the door behind me opened. Two men entered, not priests, not ecclesiarchy officials in robes of office, but something else entirely. They wore black, simple garments that bore no insignia or identification, and they moved with the silent efficiency of those who had performed their duties so many times that the actions had become automatic. They took my arms without speaking, their grips firm but not yet painful, and they turned me toward the door through which they had entered. "Take him to the chambers of reflection," the cardinal said. "He requires education in the nature of faith." The chambers of reflection. I had heard the name whispered among junior priests, spoken of in tones that suggested something terrible lurking beneath the surface of ecclesiarchal governance. But I had always dismissed such whispers as the exaggerations of those whose faith was insufficiently developed to understand the necessary disciplines of institutional order. I had not believed that such places truly existed. I had not wanted to believe. They took me down through corridors I had never seen, through passages that led beneath the cardinal's palace, into regions that appeared on no architectural plans I had ever reviewed, down past doors that were sealed with locks requiring multiple keys and genetic verification, past chambers from which sounds emerged that I tried not to identify, past cells whose occupants I glimpsed only briefly through narrow windows, set into metal doors that looked designed to contain things far more dangerous than questioning priests, down into the bedrock of Therion Majoris itself, into spaces that had been carved from stone centuries ago and had been in continuous use ever since, their walls stained with residues I did not want to examine closely. The chamber they brought me to was small, perhaps 3 meters by 3 meters, its walls bare stone, its floor fitted with drains whose purpose I understood immediately, even though I tried to convince myself I was mistaken. There was a chair in the center of the room, not a simple chair, but a device of metal and leather and restraints designed to hold a human body in positions that would become increasingly uncomfortable as time progressed. There were instruments on tables along the walls, tools whose functions I could not identify, but whose shapes suggested they had been designed for the application of precise and calibrated suffering. And there was a man waiting for me, dressed in the same black garments as my escorts, his face bearing the calm expression of a craftsman preparing to practice his trade. "Confessor Vaughan," he said, and his voice held no emotion whatsoever. Not cruelty, not satisfaction, not even the professional detachment that might have suggested he took pride in his work. "I am Brother Tertius. I will be conducting your education." They strapped me into the chair. They removed my robes, my symbols of office, everything that marked me as a priest of the Ecclesiarchy. They left me naked before this man whose eyes held nothing, whose hands moved with practiced efficiency as he selected instruments from the tables along the walls, whose manner suggested that I was not a person to him, but merely a problem to be solved through the application of techniques he had perfected across years of similar applications. The pain began. I will not describe it in detail. What I will tell you is that the pain was not the point. Brother Tertius explained this to me in the calm and patient tones of a teacher instructing a student as he worked. The Ecclesiarchy did not torture priests who asked questions simply to punish them for the asking. Punishment was crude, unsophisticated, the response of institutions that lacked the theological understanding to recognize what questioning truly represented. The Ecclesiarchy's methods were designed not to punish, but to educate, not to break, but to reform, not to destroy faith, but to reshape it into something that could never again produce the conditions in which questions might arise. You asked about contradictions in the sacred texts, Brother Tertius said, his hands busy with instruments that sent fire racing through my nervous system. You noticed that infallible documents contain claims that cannot be reconciled. This is not a flaw, Confessor Vaughan. This is not an error that crept into the doctrine through accident or oversight. This is by design. He paused in his work, allowing me a moment to process his words through the haze of agony that had become my entire existence. The contradictions exist because they must exist. A faith that is internally consistent invites analysis. A doctrine that follows logical principles can be examined through logic, tested through reason, potentially found wanting through the application of intellectual tools that any sufficiently educated mind might develop. But a faith that contradicts itself, a faith that demands belief in multiple incompatible propositions simultaneously, such a faith cannot be analyzed. It can only be accepted or rejected, embraced or denied, believed or disbelieved. There is no middle ground, no path of rational inquiry that might lead a believer from acceptance to rejection through a gradual process of discovery. I understood. Emperor, help me, strapped to that chair with my flesh screaming and my mind reeling. I understood what he was telling me. The contradictions were not failures of the system. The contradictions were the system. The Ecclesiarchy had constructed a faith that could not be questioned, because questioning required logical analysis, and logical analysis required internal consistency. And internal consistency had been deliberately excluded from the doctrine precisely to prevent the kind of inquiry that I had attempted. Every priest who noticed the contradictions faced the same choice I was facing: accept the impossibility and continue to serve, or voice the observation and be brought to chambers like this one for education, in why acceptance was the only option that preserved both life and sanity. Across the Imperium, Brother Tertius continued, his instruments finding new paths of pain through my body. There are millions of priests who have noticed what you noticed. Millions who have seen the contradictions, the inconsistencies, the logical impossibilities woven through the fabric of the imperial creed. Most of them do what you did for 53 years. They set the observations aside. They refuse to examine them closely. They choose silence over inquiry because silence is safe, and inquiry leads to chambers like this one. He leaned close, his breath warm against my ear, his voice dropping to something almost intimate. But some of them ask questions. Some of them cannot resist the urge to understand, to reconcile, to make sense of a faith that was specifically designed to resist being made sense of. They come to us, these questioners, and we educate them. We teach them what you are learning now, that the Ecclesiarchy does not require faith in truth. The Ecclesiarchy requires faith in the Ecclesiarchy. The content of the doctrine is irrelevant. What matters is the submission, the obedience, the willingness to believe whatever you are told, regardless of whether what you are told makes logical sense. The education continued for days, perhaps weeks. Time lost meaning in that chamber, measured only in cycles of pain and respite, in the rhythm of Brother Tertius's lessons delivered through instruments that left scars I carry to this day. I learned things I had never suspected about the institution I had served for 5 decades. I learned that the Ecclesiarchy maintained entire archives of contradictory texts, deliberately preserving documents that undermined each other, ensuring that the logical inconsistencies I had discovered would remain embedded in the doctrine forever. I learned that priests who questioned too publicly were not merely silenced, but disappeared. Their names struck from records, their existence denied, their fates known only to those who worked in chambers, like the one where I was being transformed from a priest who asked questions into something that would never question again. I learned that the Ecclesiarchy had always known, that its claims were not entirely true. This was the deepest secret, the revelation that Brother Tertius saved for the final days of my education, when I had been broken down sufficiently to receive it without the defenses that might have allowed me to reject its implications. The leadership of the Ecclesiarchy, the cardinals and archcardinals who set doctrine and enforced compliance, did not believe in the literal truth of the texts they declared infallible. They believed in the utility of those texts, in the function they served binding together a civilization that would otherwise fragment into a billion competing interpretations of humanity's place in the cosmos. They believed in the Ecclesiarchy itself, in its role as the glue that held the imperium together, in the necessity of faith as a tool of governance, regardless of whether that faith was grounded in accurate claims about reality. The emperor was real. His sacrifice was real. His continued existence on the golden throne was real. These things the Ecclesiarchy believed absolutely, without reservation or doubt. But everything else, the detailed doctrines, the specific rituals, the theological claims about the nature of divinity and the mechanics of salvation, all of it was human construction, built up across 10,000 years, by people who understood that humanity needed something to believe in, and who had taken responsibility for providing that something, regardless of whether it corresponded to any deeper truth. I was not being punished for asking a question. I was being educated in the nature of the institution I had served, brought into a deeper level of understanding that most priests never reached, transformed from a true believer into something more useful, a knowing participant in a system of control that required my cooperation, regardless of whether I still believed the doctrines I would be required to preach. Brother Tertius offered me a choice. When the education was finally complete, I could accept what I had learned, return to my duties with a new understanding of my role, and serve the Ecclesiarchy not as a believer, but as an enforcer, one of those who knew the truth and perpetuated the lies anyway, because the lies were necessary and the alternative was chaos on a galactic scale. Or I could reject what I had learned, cling to the faith that had been shattered in this chamber, and face the consequences that awaited those who could not be trusted to keep the secrets they had been shown. I looked at him, this man who had spent days dismantling everything I believed, and I asked him one more question, the last question I would ever ask. How many others have you educated? He smiled, and for the first time I saw something human in his expression. A weariness, a weight, a burden that he had been carrying for longer than I could imagine. Enough, he said, enough to maintain the faith, enough to ensure that the questions are always answered before they can spread, enough to keep the Imperium believing in something, even if that something is built on foundations that would crumble if anyone examined them too closely. He gestured to the door, to the corridors that led back up to the world of light and faith, and the performance of devotion that I now understood was nothing more than performance. Make your choice, Confessor Vaughan. The Ecclesiarchy requires an answer. I made my choice. I am here, speaking to you, 40 years later. Perhaps that tells you which option I selected. Perhaps it does not. I returned to service. Let me tell you what that means, truly means. To stand before congregations of thousands and preach doctrines you know to be constructions. To perform rituals you understand serve no metaphysical purpose. To hear confessions from faithful souls and absolve them of sins that you now comprehend exist only because the Ecclesiarchy declared them sins and enforced that declaration through mechanisms of guilt and fear that have nothing to do with divine judgment and everything to do with institutional control. I returned to my duties as Confessor Malchus Vaughan, and I spoke the words I had always spoken, and I performed the rituals I had always performed, and no one who looked upon me could have detected any change whatsoever in the priest who had been taken to the chambers of reflection and emerged 3 weeks later to resume his sacred obligations. The change was entirely internal. The change was everything. I watched myself preach with a detachment that I had never experienced before my education, observing my own performance from some distant vantage point, where the words I spoke sounded hollow, where the conviction I projected revealed itself as nothing more than the skilled mimicry of conviction, where the faith I had once felt with absolute certainty was replaced by a calculation of what faith should look like, how it should sound, what gestures and intonations would be most effective in maintaining the illusion that I still believed what I was saying. I became, in the terminology that Brother Tertius had used, an enforcer, one of the knowing ones, a priest who understood that the Ecclesiarchy was a machine built from human needs and human lies, and who had chosen to keep that machine running because the alternative, the collapse of faith across 1,000,000 worlds, the fragmentation of humanity into competing interpretations and conflicting doctrines, the chaos that would follow the revelation that the imperial creed was not divine truth, but institutional construction, seemed worse than the perpetuation of deception on a galactic scale. I told myself this for 15 years. I told myself that I was serving humanity, that my silence protected billions from truths they were not equipped to handle, that the lies I spoke were necessary lies, merciful lies, lies that provided comfort and structure and meaning to lives that would otherwise have neither. I almost believed it. Almost. The breaking came on a world called Cethris Prime during my 68th year of service, 15 years after my education in the chambers of reflection. I had been assigned to investigate reports of heretical deviation in one of the planet's smaller hive cities, a community of perhaps 3 million souls whose spiritual needs had been served by a single priest for nearly 4 decades. This priest, Father Cornelius Thane, an elderly man whose service record showed nothing but exemplary devotion across 41 years of ministry, had been accused by a junior colleague of teaching interpretations that deviated from orthodox doctrine. The accusation was vague, the evidence thin, but the Ecclesiarchy did not ignore such reports, and I had been dispatched to determine whether correction was necessary. I found Father Thane in his chapel, a modest structure attached to a manufacturing complex that produced ammunition components for the Imperial Guard. He was old, far older than I had expected from his records, his body bent with the weight of decades, his hands trembling with palsy that made the ritual gestures he performed imprecise and wavering. But his eyes were clear, and when he looked at me, he saw something that most people could not see: the emptiness behind my performance, the hollow space where faith had once resided, the truth of what I had become in the years since Brother Tertius had offered me my choice. "You are one of the knowing ones," he said, and it was not a question. I should have denied it. Protocol demanded denial, demanded the maintenance of the facade even among those who had been educated, demanded that we never acknowledge to each other what we had become, lest that acknowledgement spread and metastasize into something the Ecclesiarchy could not control, but something in his voice, something in his eyes, something in the simple honesty of his recognition stripped away the defenses I had maintained for 15 years. "Yes," I said, "I was educated." He nodded, unsurprised, and gestured for me to sit beside him on the worn bench where he conducted his counseling sessions with the workers of the manufactorum. I sat, and he was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that seemed too heavy for his frail body to bear. "I was educated 43 years ago," he said. "I have served this community ever since, preaching the doctrines I know to be constructed, performing the rituals I understand to be empty, maintaining the faith that I no longer possess because the alternative seemed worse than the continuation." He paused, and I saw tears forming in eyes that had witnessed more than 8 decades of human existence. But I have begun to wonder, in these final years, whether the alternative is truly worse. I have begun to question whether the lies we tell are truly merciful, or whether they are simply the easiest path for those of us who lack the courage to speak truth and accept the consequences. I did not respond. I could not respond. His words had struck something in me that I had believed dead, some fragment of the priest I had been before the chambers of reflection had transformed me into an instrument of institutional perpetuation. The junior priest who reported me, Father Thane continued, did not understand what he was reporting. He heard me speak to a dying worker, a woman whose body had been broken by 40 years of labor in the manufactorum, whose lungs were filled with the dust of the ammunition she had spent her life producing. She asked me if her suffering had meaning, if the Emperor truly saw her, if the faith she had maintained through decades of agony would be rewarded with something, anything, beyond more suffering in whatever existence followed death. His voice broke, and he looked away, and I saw in his profile the face of a man who had reached the end of something and found it empty. I could not lie to her, not in that moment. Not to a woman who had given everything and received nothing, and was asking me, with her dying breath, whether any of it had mattered. I told her the truth, that I did not know, that the doctrines I preached were human constructions, that the certainties I had offered her for 40 years were not certainties at all, but merely hopes dressed in the costume of revelation. I told her that I believed the Emperor was real, that his sacrifice was real, that something awaited us beyond death. But I told her also that I did not know what that something was, and that the Ecclesiarchy's detailed claims about salvation and damnation were the products of human imagination rather than divine communication. He turned back to me, and his eyes held something I had not seen in another person since before my education, something that might have been peace, might have been acceptance, might have been the particular calm of a man who had finally stopped running from truths he had spent decades trying to avoid. The junior priest heard part of this conversation. He did not understand what he heard, did not recognize that I was speaking truths that the Ecclesiarchy forbids, but he knew that my words deviated from orthodox doctrine, and he reported me as his training demanded. And now you are here, Confessor Vaughan, to determine what should be done with an old man who committed the unforgivable sin of honesty to a dying woman who deserved better than the lies I had been feeding her for 4 decades. I looked at this man, this priest who had carried the same burden I carried, who had made the same choice I had made, who had spent even longer than I had speaking words he knew to be constructions and performing rituals he understood to be empty. And I felt something stir in the hollow space where my faith had once resided. Not faith returning, not the certainties I had lost in the chambers of reflection, but something else. Something that might have been the first stirrings of a different kind of conviction. "What would you have me do?" I asked him. He smiled, and the expression transformed his aged features into something almost beautiful. "I would have you make a choice," he said. "The same choice I made when I spoke truth to that dying woman. The choice between continuing to serve the machine that educated us and accepting that some lies are too heavy to carry, regardless of the consequences of setting them down." I understood what he was asking. He was asking me to report him accurately, to confirm that he had spoken heresy, to set in motion the processes that would result in his correction or his execution, depending on how the cardinals chose to respond to an 83-year-old priest who had told a dying woman the truth. Or he was asking me to lie, not the lies I'd been telling for 15 years, not the institutional lies that maintained the faith across a million worlds, but a different kind of lie. A lie that would protect him, that would declare his teaching orthodox, that would allow him to continue his ministry in the time that remained to him. He was asking me to choose between the Ecclesiarchy and a single human being. He was asking me to choose between the machine and the soul. I made my choice. I submitted my report to Cardinal Vassius, the same cardinal who had sent me to the chambers of reflection 15 years before. I reported that Father Cornelius Thane was guilty of heretical deviation. I reported that he had spoken truths forbidden by ecclesiarchal doctrine. I reported every word he had said to me in that chapel, every confession he had made about his own loss of faith, and his decision to stop lying to a dying woman who deserved honesty in her final moments. And I reported that I, Confessor Malchius Vaughan, was guilty of the same heresies. I reported that I had spent 15 years preaching doctrines I knew to be constructions, that I had lied to millions of faithful souls, that I had served the machine while knowing it was a machine, that I had chosen comfort over truth and institutional preservation over honest ministry. I reported everything. Cardinal Vassius sent his men for me, as I knew he would. They took me back to the chambers of reflection, back to Brother Tertius, back to the place where I had first learned what the Ecclesiarchy truly was and what it required of those who served it. But this time, they could not offer me the choice they had offered before. This time, I had already made my choice. Not the choice between service and death, but the choice between silence and testimony, between complicity and confession, between continuing to be part of a machine I could no longer pretend was serving humanity's interests and accepting whatever consequences followed from my refusal to pretend any longer. Father Thane was executed. I was told this in my cell, told it as a lesson in what happened to those who spoke forbidden truths, told it as a warning about what awaited me if I continued to refuse the choice that Brother Tertius kept offering. But the warning meant nothing. I had already accepted that I might die for what I had done. What I had not accepted, what I could not accept, was spending whatever remained of my life speaking lies to people who deserved truth, maintaining a system that educated its priests in torture chambers, serving an institution that had transformed the emperor's sacrifice into a tool of control rather than a gift of salvation. They kept me in the chambers of reflection for 3 years. They applied their techniques, their instruments, their patient and methodical approaches to breaking minds that had proven resistant to initial education. They tried to remake me into what I had been for 15 years, a knowing servant, a willing liar, an enforcer who understood the truth and chose to perpetuate falsehood anyway. They failed. I do not know why they failed. I do not know what made me different from the countless other priests who had been educated and returned to service and maintained the machine for the rest of their lives. Perhaps it was Father Thane, his example, his willingness to speak truth to a dying woman, regardless of the cost. Perhaps it was the 83 years of his life spent in the same performance I had been giving for 15, the weight of 4 decades more of lies than I had accumulated, the vision of what I would become if I continued down the path I had been walking. Perhaps I simply broke in a different direction than they intended. They released me eventually, stripped of my rank, stripped of my ordination, stripped of everything that had identified me as a priest of the Ecclesiarchy. They did not kill me. Killing me would have required explaining why a confessor of 53 years' service had been executed, would have raised questions that the Ecclesiarchy did not want raised. Instead, they simply erased me, expunged my records, made it so that Confessor Malchius Vaughan had never existed in any official documentation. I became no one. I became nothing. And in that nothing, in that absence of identity and position, and the institutional belonging that had defined my entire existence since the age of 7, I found something I had not expected to find. I found freedom. Not the freedom to preach, not the freedom to minister, not the freedom to serve the faith I had once believed in with such absolute conviction, but the freedom to speak, to tell the truth about what the Ecclesiarchy was and what it did and why no one ever questioned its doctrines. The freedom to testify, the freedom to be here, now, speaking to you, 40 years after they stripped me of everything and cast me out into a galaxy that had no place for priests who chose truth over institutional preservation. I have spent 4 decades in the margins of the Imperium, existing in spaces where the Ecclesiarchy's reach is weak and its attention is elsewhere. I have worked as a laborer on worlds where no one knew my history, have lived among populations whose faith I once would have been responsible for maintaining, have watched from the outside as the machine I once served continued its endless work of binding humanity together, through doctrines that contradict and rituals that comfort and lies that provide meaning to lives that might otherwise find none. I have grown old in exile, my body failing in the way that bodies fail when they have seen too many years and carried too many burdens, my mind sharpening even as my flesh deteriorates into the weakness that awaits all who live long enough to experience it. And I have thought, across all those decades, about why no one questions the Ecclesiarchy. The answer is not what I believed it to be when I first entered the chambers of reflection, when Brother Tertius began my education in the mechanisms of institutional control. I believed then that silence was maintained through fear, that priests did not question because they knew what awaited questioners, that the faithful did not doubt because they had been taught that doubt was sin, that the entire system was held together by terror of consequences, just too terrible to risk through the simple act of asking whether the words spoken from pulpits might be something other than divine truth. Fear is part of the answer, but it is not the whole answer. It is not even the most important part. People do not question the Ecclesiarchy because they do not want to question it. This is the truth I have come to understand across 40 years of watching from the outside, 40 years of observing the faithful without being among them, 40 years of seeing with clarity I could never have achieved while still serving the institution that shaped my understanding of what clarity meant. The Ecclesiarchy persists not primarily because it punishes questions, but because it answers needs, deep needs, fundamental needs, needs that human beings have carried with them since before they learned to speak, and will carry with them until the species finally extincts itself in the dying light of the galaxy's last stars. The need to believe that suffering has meaning. This is the first and greatest need that the Ecclesiarchy serves, the foundation upon which all its doctrines and rituals are built. Human beings suffer. This is the unavoidable reality of existence in a universe that was not designed with human flourishing in mind. A cosmos that produces agony as readily as it produces joy and makes no distinction between those who deserve their fates and those who do not. The Ecclesiarchy tells them that their suffering matters, that it is seen by an emperor who loves them, that it accumulates towards some ultimate reward that will make the pain worthwhile. This is a lie, or at least a claim that cannot be verified, but it is a lie that makes suffering bearable in a way that truth cannot. The need to belong to something larger than oneself. This is the second great need. The hunger for connection that drives human beings to build families and communities and civilizations that span the stars. The Ecclesiarchy offers belonging on a scale that nothing else can match. Membership in a faith that encompasses 1,000,000 worlds. Participation in rituals that billions of others are performing simultaneously. Identity as part of a human family that stretches back 10,000 years and forward into futures that no individual will live to see. This belonging is constructed, maintained through doctrines that create artificial unity among populations that have nothing else in common. But the construction does not diminish the reality of what it provides. The faithful feel that they belong. The feeling is real, even if its foundations are not. The need to understand one's place in the universe. This is the third great need. The drive to make sense of existence that produces philosophies and religions, and all the frameworks through which human beings attempt to comprehend the incomprehensible. The Ecclesiarchy provides answers, not accurate answers, not consistent answers, but answers nonetheless. It tells the faithful who they are, why they exist, what they should do with the time allotted to them, what will happen when that time runs out. These answers contradict each other, fall apart under logical analysis, cannot withstand the scrutiny of minds trained to identify inconsistency. But most minds are not trained for such scrutiny, and even those that are often prefer the comfort of answers to the terror of questions that have no answers. The Ecclesiarchy understands these needs. The Ecclesiarchy was built to serve these needs. This is what I failed to grasp during my 53 years of service, what I did not fully understand, even after Brother Tertius educated me in the mechanisms of institutional control. I thought the Ecclesiarchy was a machine designed for power, for control, for the maintenance of authority over populations that might otherwise resist imperial governance. And it is these things. I do not deny that it is these things. But it is also something more, something that makes its persistence across 10 millennia comprehensible in ways that mere institutional self-interest cannot explain. The Ecclesiarchy is a response to human nature. It exists because human beings created it, not through conspiracy or calculation, but through the organic accumulation of needs met and fears addressed, and hopes given shape by doctrines that emerged from the same psychological soil that produced the needs and fears and hopes themselves. The contradictions in the texts, the inconsistencies in the rituals, the logical impossibilities woven through the fabric of the imperial creed. All of these are not failures, but features, not bugs, but the natural result of a faith that was built by human beings across millennia. Each generation adding its own answers to questions that previous generations had not thought to ask. The Ecclesiarchy cannot be reformed. I understand this now. It cannot be made consistent, cannot be purged of its contradictions, cannot be transformed into something that provides all the comforts it currently provides, while also being logically coherent and empirically defensible. The contradictions are load-bearing. Remove them, and the entire structure collapses, leaving billions of faithful with nothing to believe in, nothing to belong to, nothing to explain their place in a universe that offers no explanations except those that human beings construct for themselves. This is why no one questions the Ecclesiarchy, not because questions are forbidden, though they are, not because questioners are punished, though they are, but because the questions themselves threaten something that most human beings need more than they need truth, more than they need consistency, more than they need the cold comfort of accurate beliefs about a universe that has no inherent meaning and offers no guarantees about anything. The questions threaten hope, and hope, even false hope, even constructed hope, even hope built on foundations that crumble when examined too closely, is something that human beings will kill and die for, will sacrifice everything for, will refuse to surrender even when surrender is the only rational response to evidence that the hope is misplaced. I questioned. I paid the price of questioning. I lost everything. My position, my identity, my place in the institution that had been my entire existence since childhood. And I am not certain that I was right to question. This is the final truth I have arrived at, the conclusion that 40 years of exile and reflection have produced. I cannot go back to believing what I believed before the chambers of reflection, cannot pretend that the doctrines I preached were anything other than human constructions designed to serve human needs. But I can recognize that those needs are real, that the suffering they address is real, that the comfort they provide is real, even if it is built on foundations that do not bear examination. The faithful of the Imperium believe in an emperor who loves them, in a salvation that awaits them, in a meaning that makes their suffering worthwhile. These beliefs may not be true, but they are theirs, and they serve purposes that my truth-telling cannot serve. And perhaps there is a kind of mercy in the lies that the Ecclesiarchy tells, a mercy that I, in my insistence on honesty, was too proud to recognize until I had lost everything and had nothing left except the questions that no one wants answered. I do not know what awaits us after death. I do not know if the Emperor hears our prayers. I do not know if the faith I spent 53 years preaching connects to anything real beyond the psychological needs it was constructed to serve. But I know that human beings need to believe something. I know that the alternative to the Ecclesiarchy's lies is not truth, but chaos, the collapse of meaning, the fragmentation of hope, the abandonment of billions to a universe that offers no comfort except what we construct for ourselves. Why does no one question the Ecclesiarchy? Because the questions hurt more than the lies. Because the truth is a blade that cuts the hands that hold it. Because human beings would rather believe in something, anything, than face the possibility that there is nothing to believe in at all. I questioned. I found my answers. I have lived with those answers for 40 years. And sometimes, in the darkness of the night, when sleep will not come, and the weight of my solitary existence presses down upon me, like the weight of all the cathedrals on Ophelia 7, I wonder whether the faithful I left behind, the ones who never questioned, who never doubted, who went to their deaths believing in salvation I could not promise them, were wiser than I was. They had their lies. They had their comfort. They had their hope. I have only the truth. And the truth, I have learned, is a cold companion in a universe that was not designed to be understood. The Emperor protects. Perhaps he does. Perhaps he does not. I can no longer say with certainty what I once proclaimed with absolute conviction. But I know this. The faithful who believe he protects them are, in some ways I cannot fully articulate, more fortunate than I am. A former priest who knows too much to believe and cannot forget enough to find peace in the doctrines that once gave my existence meaning. This is my testimony. This is what I have learned about why no one questions the Ecclesiarchy. And this is my final confession. I am not certain that questioning was the right choice. I am only certain that it was mine.